The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains, startling Violet Harper awake as she clutched her newborn daughter to her chest. Her heart pounded wildly, a painful reminder that they were alone and vulnerable in this unforgiving wilderness of the Arizona Territory, 1877. She had been on the run for 3 days now, ever since her husband's gambling debts had caught up with them in the form of armed debt collectors who'd shown no mercy. "Hush now, little one," she whispered, rocking the tiny bundle as she peered through the cracks of the abandoned barn she'd found shelter in. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered wood floor, illuminating dust motes that danced in the light. Her milk-swollen breasts ached, and exhaustion clawed at her every nerve. 22 years old and already a widow with a week-old baby, Violet wondered how much farther she could make it on foot. The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent terror coursing through her veins. She scrambled back into the shadows, pressing herself against the wall as her baby started to fuss. "Please, darling, please," she begged in a whisper, trying to quiet the infant. The hoofbeats stopped just outside. "Hello," a deep voice called. "Anybody in there?" Violet held her breath. The barn door creaked open, flooding the space with sunlight. Silhouetted against the bright backdrop stood a tall figure, hat pulled low over his eyes, a rifle resting casually against his shoulder. "I ain't looking for trouble," the man said, stepping inside. "Saw smoke from a small fire last night. Thought someone might need help." As her eyes adjusted, Violet could make out his features' weathered skin bronzed by the sun, a strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble, and eyes the color of a stormy sky. He wasn't the type of man who'd inspire trust at first glance, with his worn leather vest and dusty boots, but there was something in his stance that wasn't threatening. "Please," Violet said, her voice cracking with dehydration and fear. "We don't want any trouble either." The stranger's eyes fell to the bundle in her arms, and his expression softened immediately. He lowered his rifle, propping it against a bale of hay. "Name's Xavier Blackwood," he said, removing his hat to reveal dark hair that curled slightly at his temples. "Most folks call me Zav." "Violet," she replied cautiously. "Violet Harper, and this is Eliza." Xavier approached slowly, hands visible at his sides. "When's the last time you had anything to eat, Mrs. Harper?" The rumble of her stomach answered before she could. Xavier nodded as if he'd expected as much. "I've got provisions on my horse. Food, water." He paused, noting her disheveled appearance and the desperation in her eyes. "Looks like you could use both." He turned to go fetch the supplies, then stopped at the doorway. "Don't worry, madam." "I ain't rich, but I'll love you right," the cowboy told the woman with a newborn. "By which I mean, I'll treat you and your little one with proper respect. My mama raised me better than to leave a woman and child in need." Something about his words, the sincerity behind them, made tears spring to Violet's eyes. It had been so long since anyone had shown her simple kindness. Xavier returned with a canteen of water and a cloth sack. He kept a respectful distance as he set them down within her reach. "Jerky, biscuits, and a bit of dried fruit. Not much, but it'll put some strength back in you." Violet reached for the water first, desperate to slake her thirst. After several long gulps, she looked up at him with clearer eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." "Just Xavier," he said, settling down on a hay bale across from her, "or Zav, never been one for formalities." "What brings you out this way?" she asked, unable to hide her suspicion entirely. "Heading to my brother's ranch near Tucson. Got work waiting for me there." He gestured to the baby. "How old?" "Just over a week," Violet replied, adjusting her hold on Eliza, who had begun to squirm. Xavier's brow furrowed. "And you're out here alone. Where's your husband, if you don't mind my asking?" Violet swallowed hard. "Dead. 3 days ago. Men came collecting on his debts." "He tried to run." She looked down at her daughter's peaceful face. "I ran too, only I got away." Xavier was silent for a long moment. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harper." "Just Violet," she corrected, echoing his earlier words. "Never been one for formalities either." That earned her a slight smile, transforming his rugged face into something almost handsome. "Where were you headed?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Away from Silver Creek. I have an aunt in California, but that's too far to walk, especially with Eliza." Xavier studied her thoughtfully. "My brother's ranch is a good place. Honest work, decent folks." He could use help around the main house, and there's a small cabin where you could stay. He shrugged. It's not much, but it'd be a roof over your heads until you figure out your next move. Violet stared at him, searching for any sign of deception. Finding none, she still hesitated. Why would you help us? Because it's the right thing to do, he said simply. And because I know what it's like to be on your own with nowhere to go. Violet looked down at her daughter, considering their options, which were few to none. Death awaited them if they stayed in this barn much longer, from exposure if not from her husband's creditors finding them. All right, she said finally. We'll go with you to your brother's ranch. Xavier nodded, satisfied. We'll rest here today. You need sleep, and the baby needs you strong. We'll start at first light tomorrow. As he moved to secure the barn for the night, Violet watched him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. She didn't know this man, but something told her she could trust him. At least for now. That night, with a small fire crackling between them and her belly full for the first time in days, Violet nursed Eliza while Xavier kept watch by the door, his back turned to give her privacy. In the soft glow of the firelight, she studied his profile, strong and steady, like a man who'd weathered many storms and expected many more. Thank you, she said quietly. He glanced over his shoulder, careful to keep his eyes averted from her exposed breast. Get some sleep, Violet. Tomorrow's a long ride. As she drifted off, Violet thought that perhaps they had a chance after all, a small one, but a chance nonetheless. The journey to the Blackwood Ranch took 3 days on horseback. Xavier insisted Violet ride while he walked alongside, leading the horse with one hand on the reins. Despite her protests, he refused to compromise on this point. You're still recovering from childbirth, he'd said firmly, and you're carrying precious cargo. So Violet rode, with Eliza securely wrapped against her chest in a sling Xavier had fashioned from a spare shirt. The baby remained remarkably calm during their journey, as if sensing the importance of their quiet passage through the territory. By the second day, Violet had learned that Xavier was 30 years old, had fought briefly in the final days of the Civil War as a young man, and had spent the years since working cattle drives across the West. He spoke little of his past beyond that, and Violet didn't pry. She understood the value of privacy all too well. In return, she told him about growing up in Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a blacksmith. How she'd met William Harper when she was 18, charmed by his good looks and grand promises of adventure in the West. How those promises had turned to dust as his gambling addiction consumed him, leaving them constantly on the move, always one step ahead of his debts. I should have left him, she admitted on the third day of their journey as the landscape began to change from dusty plains to rolling hills dotted with mesquite and prickly pear. Before Eliza came along, but I kept thinking he would change. Xavier gave her a look of understanding rather than judgment. People rarely change unless they want to, and wanting isn't enough, they have to need it, deep down. Is that why you changed? Violet asked, sensing there was more to his story. His lips quirked in a half-smile. What makes you think I've changed? The way you talk about who you were, like he's someone else entirely. Xavier was quiet for so long that Violet thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, I was wild once, angry at the world, did things I'm not proud of. He adjusted his hat against the afternoon sun. Then I watched my best friend die in a saloon over a card game gone wrong. Made me realize I was heading the same way if I didn't straighten out. I'm sorry about your friend, Violet said softly. It was a long time ago. He pointed ahead to where the land rose into a gentle hill. Just over that rise is Blackwood Ranch. We'll be there before sunset. The ranch sprawled across a valley nestled between two ridges, the main house standing proud in the center, with a large barn and several outbuildings surrounding it. Fields of grazing cattle stretched to the north, while to the south, rows of vegetables and fruit trees hinted at a well-established homestead. As they approached, a man emerged from the main house, hand hovering near the gun at his hip until he recognized Xavier. That's James, Xavier explained. My older brother. James Blackwood was a larger version of Xavier, with the same storm gray eyes but a fuller beard and broader shoulders. His stern expression softened when he saw his brother and outright transformed to astonishment when he noticed Violet and the baby. Xav. He called, striding forward to meet them. Didn't expect you for another week. His eyes darted to Violet, and didn't expect company at all. Xavier helped Violet down from the horse before addressing his brother. James, this is Violet Harper and her daughter, Eliza. They needed help, and I offered them a place here. That cabin by the South Creek still vacant. James studied Violet with undisguised curiosity but nodded. It is. He touched the brim of his hat in greeting. Madam, welcome to Blackwood Ranch. A woman appeared in the doorway of the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. Xavier, she called warmly, hurrying down the steps. She was a petite woman with auburn hair twisted into a practical bun, her face weathered but kind. And this is Sarah, James's wife, Xavier said to Violet. Best cook in the territory, and the reason this place runs so smoothly. Sarah embraced Xavier before turning her attention to Violet and the baby. Unlike her husband, she showed no surprise at their presence, only concern. Oh, you poor dear, she said, taking in Violet's exhausted state. You look dead on your feet. Come inside, both of you. Dinner's almost ready, and I'll have Matilda prepare the cabin for you after. Before Violet could respond, Sarah had ushered her toward the house with gentle insistence, leaving the brothers to handle the horse and supplies. The main house was larger than it appeared from the outside, with a spacious kitchen dominated by a massive wooden table. The smell of fresh bread and stew made Violet's mouth water, reminding her that they'd eaten only jerky and hardtack that day. Sit, Sarah insisted, pulling out a chair. When was the last time this little one was fed? Just before we arrived, Violet said, grateful to rest her aching body. She's been remarkably good during the journey. Sarah smiled, peering at the sleeping infant. She's beautiful. How old? Almost 2 weeks now. Sarah's eyes widened. 2 weeks, and you're traveling? My goodness, you must be exhausted in ways I can't even imagine. She bustled about, pouring a glass of milk and setting it before Violet. Drink up. Good for the baby, good for you. By the time the men entered the house, Sarah had extracted most of Violet's story, making appropriate noises of sympathy and outrage at the appropriate moments. The dining table was laden with steaming bowls of rabbit stew, fresh bread, and butter, with a jar of preserves and a plate of sliced cheese completing the feast. I'll hold the little one while you eat, Sarah offered, and after a moment's hesitation, Violet handed Eliza over, surprised by how much she trusted this woman she'd just met. Over dinner, James and Xavier discussed ranch business cattle prices, a broken fence in the north pasture, a new stallion James had purchased for breeding. Violet ate quietly, savoring each bite of the best meal she'd had in months, perhaps years. So, James said eventually, turning his attention to Violet. Xav says you need a place to stay for a while. Yes, Violet replied, straightening her shoulders. But I'm not looking for charity. I can work. I know how to cook, clean, so tend a garden. I was helping my father in his blacksmith shop before I married, so I'm not afraid of hard work. James exchanged a glance with his wife. We could use help around the house, especially with Sarah expecting come winter. Violet looked at Sarah in surprise. The woman's hand went instinctively to her still flat stomach, a smile spreading across her face. Early days yet, she said. But yes, another Blackwood is on the way. Congratulations, Violet said sincerely. The cabin by the creek needs some fixing up, James continued, but it's sound. Roof doesn't leak and the stove works. It was the foreman's place before he moved on last year. I'll help get it ready, Xavier volunteered. Shouldn't take more than a day or two. And just like that, Violet found herself with a home, however temporary, and the promise of honest work. After dinner, Xavier escorted her and Eliza to the cabin, carrying a lantern to light their way in the gathering darkness. The cabin was indeed small, just one room with a stove, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and a few shelves. But it was clean, and someone had already stocked it with basic provisions and fresh linens. It's not much, Xavier said, lighting the lamp that sat on the table. But it's yours for as long as you need it. Violet looked around, unable to believe her change in fortune. Just 4 days ago, she'd been hiding in a barn, certain she and her daughter were going to die. Now they had shelter, food, and the promise of safety. It's perfect, she whispered. Xavier shifted uncomfortably, unused to gratitude. Sarah will be by in the morning to help you get settled. I'll be working on the fence with James, but I'll stop by to check on you both. He lingered at the door, as if wanting to say more but unsure how to form the words. Finally, he simply touched the brim of his hat and said, "Good night, Violet. Good night, little Eliza." After he left, Violet sat on the edge of the bed, cradling her sleeping daughter. For the first time since Eliza's birth, she allowed herself to cry not from despair, but from relief. They were safe, at least for now. And if she fell asleep, thinking of storm-gray eyes and gentle hands, well, that was her secret to keep. The next few weeks established a rhythm to life at Blackwood Ranch. Violet worked alongside Sarah in the main house during the day, helping with cooking, cleaning, and mending, with Eliza either sleeping in a makeshift cradle or strapped to Violet's chest. In the evenings, she returned to her cabin, often finding that Xavier had left small offerings, a bundle of wildflowers, a carved wooden toy for Eliza, or once, a book of poetry he'd picked up in town. They rarely spoke directly about these gifts. Xavier would simply nod when she thanked him, as if embarrassed by his own kindness. But gradually, as spring warmed into summer, a friendship began to form between them. One evening in late June, Xavier knocked on her cabin door just as Violet was putting Eliza down for the night. The baby, now almost 2 months old, had begun to show her personality alert, curious, and blessed with a smile that could melt the hardest heart. "Sorry to disturb you," Xavier said when Violet opened the door. "Just wanted to let you know I'm riding into town tomorrow for supplies." "Thought you might have a list of things you need." Violet hesitated. "I don't have much money." "Consider it an advance on your wages," he said easily. "Sarah says you're worth your weight in gold around here." "In that case," Violet said with a small smile, "I could use some fabric for a new dress, and thread, maybe some soap that doesn't smell like cattle." Xavier chuckled. "I'll see what I can do." He glanced past her to where Eliza lay in her cradle. "How's she doing?" "Growing like a weed," Violet said proudly. "Would you like to come in and see her? She's not asleep yet." Xavier hesitated only briefly before stepping inside. The cabin was small enough that his presence seemed to fill it entirely, making Violet acutely aware of him in a way she hadn't been before. He moved to the cradle, looking down at Eliza with a softness in his expression that made Violet's heart skip. "She has your eyes," he observed quietly. "Same blue." "Yes, thank goodness," Violet said before she could stop herself. "Williams were brown." Xavier glanced at her, recognizing the relief in her tone. "You don't talk much about him." "Not much to say that's good," Violet admitted, sitting at the table. After a moment, Xavier joined her. He wasn't cruel exactly, just selfish, weak, always chasing the next big win that never came. "How did you meet him?" "He came through our town selling medicinal tonics," Violet said, smiling ruefully at the memory. All false promises in fancy bottles, but oh, could he talk. Made it sound like he was offering the keys to paradise. I was young and bored and thought he was my ticket to adventure. "And was he? An adventure, I mean." "Of a sort," Violet said dryly. "If you consider running from town to town, never knowing if you'll eat that day or have a roof over your head an adventure." Xavier was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry you went through that." "Don't be," Violet said, glancing at Eliza. "It gave me her. And it taught me what kind of man to avoid in the future." Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of attraction, perhaps, or at least the potential for it. Xavier broke the moment first, standing abruptly. "I should let you get some rest," he said. "I'll be back from town by sundown tomorrow." At the door he paused, looking back at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Violet." "Yes, I'm glad you're here." Simple words, but they warmed her more than any grand declaration could have. "So am I, Xavier, so am I." After he left, Violet moved to the window, watching his figure disappear into the darkness toward the bunkhouse where he stayed. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart race beneath her fingers. "Don't be foolish," she whispered to herself. "He's just being kind." But even as she said it, Violet knew it wasn't entirely true. There was something growing between them, something that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. Xavier returned from town the next evening with not only the fabric and soap she'd requested, but also a small silver rattle for Eliza and a ribbon the exact shade of Violet's eyes. "The shopkeeper's wife helped me pick it out," he said when Violet held up the ribbon in surprise. "Said it would match your eyes." His ears reddened slightly as he said it. "It's perfect," Violet said softly, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you." As summer progressed, their moments together grew more frequent. Xavier would stop by her cabin in the evenings, sometimes bringing James and Sarah along, other times coming alone. They would sit on the small porch Xavier had built for her, watching the sunset while Eliza slept inside. They talked about everything and nothing: his travels across the West, her dreams of someday having a place of her own, books they'd read, people they'd known. One warm July evening, as they sat in comfortable silence watching fireflies dance over the creek, Xavier said, "You know, you don't have to leave, if you don't want to." Violet looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean this place, the cabin, the job at the main house. It can be permanent if you want it to be." He kept his eyes on the horizon. "James and Sarah adore you and Eliza, and the ranch is doing well enough that they can afford to keep you on." "And what about you?" Violet asked quietly. "Would you want me to stay?" Now he did look at her, his storm-gray eyes reflecting the fading light. "Yes," he said simply. "I would." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Violet's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "I've been alone a long time, Violet," Xavier continued, his voice low. "Moving from place to place, never settling, but being here, seeing you and Eliza every day." He trailed off, searching for words. "It makes me want things I never thought I could have." "What things?" Violet whispered, though she knew the answer. "A home. A family." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. The touch of his fingers against her cheek sent warmth cascading through her. It had been so long since she'd been touched with tenderness, with desire untainted by selfishness. She leaned into his hand almost unconsciously. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "The last time I trusted a man." "I know," Xavier said, "and I'm not asking for anything now. Just wanted you to know how I feel, that there's a place for you here if you want it. With me if you decide that's what you want." He stood then, respectfully keeping his distance. "Think about it, there's no rush." As he walked away, Violet touched her cheek where his fingers had been, her mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to call him back, to throw caution to the wind and see where this feeling between them might lead. But the wiser part, the part that had been hurt before, the part responsible for a tiny life, held her back. She needed time. And thankfully, Xavier was willing to give it to her. August brought scorching heat and the cattle roundup, keeping Xavier busy from dawn till dusk. Violet saw him only in glimpses, riding out with the other ranch hands in the morning, returning dusty and exhausted in the evening. She missed their conversations, the quiet companionship they'd developed over the summer. One night, a terrible thunderstorm swept across the ranch, lightning splitting the sky and thunder shaking the very foundation of her cabin. Eliza wailed in terror, and Violet paced the floor with her, trying to soothe both the baby and her own frayed nerves. A pounding at the door startled her. She opened it to find Xavier, soaked to the skin, concern etched on his face. "Are you all right?" he shouted over the howling wind. "The creek's rising fast. James sent me to bring you both to the main house." Violet looked past him to see that, indeed, the usually placid creek had become a raging torrent, already lapping at the edge of her small porch. Fear gripped her as she realized how quickly the situation had deteriorated. "Let me grab a few things," she said, handing Eliza to him without hesitation. The baby immediately quieted in his arms as if sensing safety despite the storm. Violet threw a few essentials into a sack: clean diapers for Eliza, a change of clothes, the silver rattle Xavier had given her. When she turned back, she found Xavier singing softly to the baby, a lullaby she didn't recognize. The sight of this strong man cradling her daughter with such gentleness made her heart swell. "Ready," she said, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Xavier looked up, and in his eyes she saw not just concern, but something deeper. "Stay close to me," he said. the path slippery. They made their way to the main house through driving rain, Xavier keeping one arm firmly around Violet while cradling Eliza against his chest with the other. By the time they reached the safety of the house, they were all drenched, but Eliza, protected by Xavier's body, was the driest. Sarah hurried to take the baby while James helped Violet to a chair by the fire. Xavier stood dripping on the threshold, reluctant to bring more water into the house. "Get in here and get dry, you fool," James ordered, throwing a towel at his brother, "before you catch your death." The storm raged all night, but inside the Blackwood home, warmth and safety prevailed. After changing into dry clothes borrowed from Sarah, Violet sat in the kitchen with Eliza asleep in her arms, watching Xavier and James play checkers by lamplight. "The cabin might be flooded," James said, jumping one of Xavier's pieces. "Creek's never risen this high before." "We'll check at first light," Xavier replied, his brow furrowed in concentration over the game. "If it is, we'll rebuild, better and higher." Violet couldn't help asking. Xavier looked up, meeting her eyes. "Yes, if you're staying, that is." The simple certainty in his voice, the way he included her in his future plans without presumption, it touched something deep inside her. In that moment, watching him across the warm kitchen with his hair still damp from the rain he'd braved to keep her and Eliza safe, Violet knew she was falling in love with him. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. "I'm staying," she said softly, and was rewarded with a smile that lit his entire face. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a transformed landscape. As feared, Violet's cabin had indeed flooded, the water reaching nearly a foot up the walls. "It'll take weeks to dry out properly," Xavier said as they surveyed the damage, "and even then the risk of mold." "We'll build a new one," James decided. "Higher ground, better construction. In the meantime, Violet and Eliza can stay in the main house." Over the next month, whenever they weren't busy with ranch work, Xavier and James, along with several of the ranch hands, worked on constructing a new cabin for Violet and Eliza. Located on higher ground closer to the main house, it was larger than the previous one, with 2 rooms instead of 1 and a proper front porch. Violet watched the progress with a mix of gratitude and growing affection for the man who seemed determined to give her and Eliza a safe, comfortable home. Xavier consulted her on every detail, from the placement of windows to the height of the shelves. When she mentioned once that she'd always dreamed of having a small garden, he added a fenced plot behind the cabin without being asked. Their relationship progressed slowly, respectfully. A brush of hands while passing tools, a lingering glance across the dinner table, conversations that stretched late into the evening after Eliza was asleep. Xavier never pushed, never presumed, yet Violet could feel his desire for her matching her own for him. By mid-September, the new cabin was ready. On the day Violet and Eliza were to move in, Xavier arrived at the main house early, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I thought you might like to see it first before bringing Eliza over," he said. "Make sure everything's to your liking." They walked together to the new cabin, the autumn air crisp around them. When Xavier opened the door, Violet gasped in surprise. The interior had been furnished not just with the basic necessities, but with touches that spoke of care and attention to detail. Curtains hung at the windows, made from the fabric Xavier had bought her in town. A rocking chair sat by the stove, perfect for nursing Eliza. And in the corner of the main room stood a small bookshelf, filled with books. Where did those come from? Violet asked, running her fingers along the spines in wonder. "Been collecting them from town over the past few weeks," Xavier said, watching her reaction carefully. "Remembered you saying how much you missed reading." Tears pricked at Violet's eyes. It was such a thoughtful gift, so perfectly aligned with her desires that it overwhelmed her. "There's one more thing," Xavier said, leading her to the second room. "For Eliza." The small bedroom held a beautifully crafted wooden crib, far finer than anything Violet could have afforded. Carved into the headboard were delicate flowers, and in the center, the name Eliza. "Xavier," Violet breathed, touching the smooth wood. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. Just wanted to give you both something special." Violet turned to face him, overcome with emotion. "Why are you doing all this for us?" Xavier reached up to cup her cheek, his touch so gentle it made her heart ache. "Because you deserve it, because seeing you happy makes me happy." He paused, his storm-gray eyes searching hers. "Because I love you, Violet, you and Eliza both." The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Violet closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, allowing herself to feel the full weight of her own emotions. "I love you too," she whispered, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself, but I do." Xavier's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tender, questioning at first, then deepening as Violet responded, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. When they finally broke apart, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I know it hasn't been long," he said softly, "and I know you've been hurt before. We can take this as slow as you need." Violet nodded, grateful for his understanding. "I want to do this right, for Eliza's sake as well as ours." "We will," Xavier promised, taking her hands in his, one day at a time. That evening, as Violet rocked Eliza to sleep in their new home, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. Outside, she could hear Xavier chopping wood for her stove, the rhythmic thunk a comforting reminder of his presence. Later, when Eliza was asleep in her new crib, Violet joined Xavier on the porch. They sat side by side on the bench he'd built, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I never thought I'd have this," Violet admitted, her shoulder pressed against his. "After everything with William, I was sure I'd spend my life alone, just me and Eliza against the world." Xavier slipped his arm around her, drawing her closer. "You're not alone anymore, neither of you." She turned her face up to his, still marveling at the way his nearness affected her. "Promise." Instead of answering with words, Xavier kissed her again, a silent vow more binding than any spoken pledge. Violet melted into him, allowing herself to trust, to hope, to believe in the possibility of happiness. As autumn deepened into winter, so did their relationship. Xavier spent most evenings at Violet's cabin, helping with chores, playing with Eliza, and simply enjoying their company. The baby had taken to him completely, reaching for him whenever he entered the room and falling asleep contentedly in his arms. "She knows a good man when she sees one," Sarah remarked one day as they watched Xavier walking with Eliza bundled against his chest, pointing out the bare trees and the birds that remained despite the cold. "Yes," Violet agreed softly. "She does." Christmas approached, bringing with it preparations for celebration. The Blackwood Ranch traditionally hosted a gathering for neighboring ranchers and townspeople, a tradition Sarah was determined to maintain despite her advancing pregnancy. "This year will be special," she told Violet as they prepared decorations. "Your first Christmas with us, and the last before this little one arrives." She patted her rounded belly fondly. The day before Christmas Eve, Xavier asked Violet to take a walk with him after dinner. Sarah volunteered to watch Eliza, her knowing smile suggesting she had some idea of Xavier's intentions. They walked through the crisp evening air, their breath forming clouds in the darkness. Xavier seemed unusually quiet, almost nervous, and Violet found herself wondering what was on his mind. "Cold night," she commented, breaking the silence. Oh yes," Xavier cleared his throat. "Violet, there's something I want to ask you," her heart quickened. "Yes," he stopped walking, turning to face her fully. In the moonlight, his expression was solemn yet filled with such tenderness that it took her breath away. "These past months with you and Eliza have been the happiest of my life," he began. "I never thought I'd find someone like you strong, kind, beautiful inside and out." He took her gloved hands in his. "I know it hasn't been very long, and I know you've been hurt before, but I love you, Violet. I love Eliza as if she were my own, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to both of you." Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a small object that glinted in the moonlight, a simple gold ring. "It was my mother's," he explained. "James has been keeping it safe all these years, said it should go to whichever of us found a woman worthy of it." Xavier dropped to one knee in the snow, still holding her hands. "Violet Harper, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Let me be a father to Eliza and perhaps someday to other children we might have together." Tears sprang to Violet's eyes, freezing on her lashes in the cold air. For a brief moment, fear threatened to overwhelm her fear of making another mistake, of trusting the wrong man again. But as she looked into Xavier's earnest face, she knew with absolute certainty that he was nothing like William. Xavier was solid, dependable, kind of man who showed his love through actions as well as words. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Xavier, I'll marry you." His face broke into a radiant smile as he stood, slipping the ring onto her finger over her glove. Then he swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his joy. Violet laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck as he spun her in a circle. When he set her down, Xavier kissed her with a passion that warmed her despite the winter chill. "I promise," he said against her lips, "to love you right, Violet, you and Eliza both, every day for the rest of my life." "I know you will," Violet replied, resting her head against his chest. "That's why I'm saying yes." They returned to the main house hand in hand, their happiness obvious to all. Sarah burst into tears of joy when they announced their engagement, while James clapped his brother on the back with gruff approval. "About time," he said, though Xavier had only known Violet for half a year. Never seen two people more right for each other. They decided to marry in the spring, when the weather would be fair and Sarah's baby would have arrived. In the meantime, Violet moved into the larger bedroom of her cabin, while Xavier continued to sleep in the bunkhouse, a concession to propriety that both found increasingly difficult to maintain as their desire for each other grew. Just a few more months, Xavier would remind them both when their goodnight kisses threatened to become something more. "We'll do this proper." Winter passed in a flurry of wedding preparations and anticipation for the newest Blackwood. In late February, Sarah gave birth to a healthy boy they named Thomas, after James and Xavier's father. Violet assisted with the birth, using knowledge gained from her own experience to support Sarah through the difficult hours. When it was over and Sarah lay exhausted but triumphant with her son in her arms, she reached for Violet's hand. "You're truly family now," she said. "Not just because you're marrying Xavier, but because you were here for this, sisters by choice." Violet squeezed her hand, too moved to speak. After a lifetime of loneliness, she had found not just love with Xavier, but a whole family who accepted her and Eliza without reservation. Spring arrived with an explosion of wildflowers across the ranch, nature's own decoration for the upcoming wedding. They planned a simple ceremony by the creek, with just the Blackwoods, the ranch hands, and a few neighbors in attendance. The local minister would perform the service, and Sarah insisted on preparing a feast despite having a newborn to care for. "You can help," she told Violet when she protested. "Consider it your last duty as my assistant before you become my sister-in-law officially." The night before the wedding, Xavier came to Violet's cabin after Eliza was asleep. They sat on the porch as they had so many times before, looking at the stars and talking of the future. "James says the North Pasture cabin could be ours," Xavier said, his arm around her shoulders. "It's larger than this one, room for us and Eliza and any other little ones that might come along." Violet leaned into him, content. "I'd like that, though I've grown fond of this place too." "We'll keep it for guests," Xavier suggested, "or maybe as a schoolhouse someday when there are more children on the ranch." The ease with which he included her in these long-term plans still amazed Violet. William had always spoken of his future, his plans. Xavier thought only in terms of we and ours. "Are you nervous?" he asked, sensing her reflective mood. "About tomorrow? No," Violet said truthfully. "For the first time in my life, I'm absolutely certain I'm making the right choice." Xavier kissed her temple. "I'll see you tomorrow then." "I'll be the one waiting at the end of the aisle, probably looking terrified but feeling like the luckiest man alive." "And I'll be the one walking toward you," Violet replied, "knowing I am the luckiest woman." The wedding day dawned clear and warm, as if nature itself approved of their union. Sarah helped Violet dress in a simple but elegant gown of pale blue, because white isn't practical out here, and besides, blue brings out your eyes, she had insisted when ordering the fabric from town. "Eliza," now 8 months old and recently taking her first tentative steps, was dressed in a matching shade, her dark curls adorned with a small circlet of wildflowers. She babbled happily as Sarah arranged Violet's hair, seeming to understand that something special was happening. "There," Sarah said, stepping back to admire her work. "You look beautiful. Xavier won't know what hit him." A knock at the door announced James's arrival. He would be walking Violet down the aisle, a role he had offered with surprising emotion. "Since your father can't be here," he had said gruffly. "Ready?" he asked now, his eyes widening appreciatively at the sight of her. "You look lovely, Violet." "Thank you," she said, suddenly nervous despite her assurances to Xavier the night before. "For everything, James." "For welcoming us, for giving us a home." James shook his head. "No thanks needed. You've brought life back to this place and happiness to my brother. That's gift enough." With Sarah carrying Eliza and James escorting Violet, they made their way to the creek where the ceremony would take place. A simple arch of branches and flowers marked the spot, with the assembled guests standing in a semicircle facing it. And there, waiting beside the minister, stood Xavier. He had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair and wore a new shirt and vest that Sarah had insisted on ordering from town. But it was his expression that took Violet's breath away, a look of such wonder and love that it brought tears to her eyes. As Violet approached, Xavier stepped forward to meet her, unable to wait for the formal giving away. He took her hands in his, and in that moment it felt as if they were the only two people in the world. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, but Violet barely heard the words. She was lost in Xavier's storm-gray eyes, in the warmth of his hands holding hers, in the absolute rightness of this moment. When it came time for the vows, Xavier spoke with a clear, steady voice. "I, Xavier Blackwood, take you, Violet Harper, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love, honor, and cherish you all the days of my life. I promise to be a good father to Eliza and to any children we may be blessed with. I promise to build a life with you filled with respect, understanding, and joy." He squeezed her hands gently. "I ain't rich, but I'll love you right every day for as long as I live." Tears streamed down Violet's face as she repeated her own vows, her voice thick with emotion but unwavering in certainty. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier pulled her into a kiss that sealed their promises more effectively than any words could have done. The celebration afterward was joyous, with food and music and dancing lasting well into the evening. Eliza was passed from arm to arm, adored by all, but especially by Xavier, who proudly introduced her to everyone as "my daughter." As night fell, they slipped away to the north pasture cabin, which had been prepared for their wedding night. For the first time, they would sleep under the same roof, in the same bed as husband and wife. Later, lying in Xavier's arms, Violet marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From a frightened widow hiding in a barn with a newborn, to a beloved wife and mother with a home and family that exceeded her wildest dreams. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked, tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I'm happy," Violet said simply. "Truly, completely happy." He smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "That's all I want, Violet, to make you and Eliza happy for the rest of our lives." "You already do," she assured him, snuggling closer. "More than I ever thought possible." In the years that followed, the Blackwood Ranch thrived, as did Xavier and Violet's family. Eliza grew into a bright, spirited girl who adored her adoptive father and the cousins she played with daily. A year after their wedding, Violet gave birth to a son they named Michael, who had his father's storm-gray eyes and his mother's gentle temperament. 2 years later, twin girls Ruth and Rebecca completed their family. Xavier proved to be the father Violet had always hoped her children would have: patient, loving, firm when needed but always fair. Together, they built a life rich in love if not in material wealth, creating a home where laughter was common and kindness was the rule. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Xavier took Violet back to the creek where they had married. The children were with Sarah and James for the evening, giving them a rare moment alone. "Do you remember what I promised you here?" Xavier asked, holding her close as they watched the sunset reflect on the water. "Every word," Violet assured him. And you've kept those promises, Xavier, every single one. He turned her in his arms, looking down at her with the same love that had been there from the beginning. I want you to know, he said softly, that finding you and Eliza was the best thing that ever happened to me. You gave me a purpose, a family, a home. Violet reached up to touch his face, now bearing a few more lines than when they'd met, but no less handsome to her eyes. And you saved us, she reminded him. In every way a person can be saved. As the last light faded from the sky, Xavier kissed her with the same passion as on their wedding day, perhaps even deeper for the years of shared life between them. I love you, Violet Blackwood, he whispered against her lips. And I love you, Xavier Blackwood, she replied. Today, tomorrow, always. They walked back to their home hand in hand, to the children who waited for them, to the life they had built together, a life that had begun with a simple promise from a cowboy to a woman with a newborn. I ain't rich, but I'll love you right, and he had, every day, with everything he had. It was more than enough. It was everything.